Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon. And today we are lucky to have one of the most articulate younger voices in politics today. You may have seen him on GB News. He's also a writer for the Daily Mail. It is, of course, Mr. Charlie Downs. How are you doing, Charlie?
Hello, Nick. It's great to be with you.
Well, thanks for doing it. I've got so many things I could ask you. I don't know where to start, but the obvious place to start is you've been somewhat involved with Reform UK. So I wanted to ask you, what is your take on the local election results and, of course, that Runcorn by-election?
Well, I know from my sort of sources inside Reform that this was really the kind of make or break moment, these local elections and the by-election in Runcorn. And I think a lot of people felt that if they really pulled it out of the bag, then it was kind of evidence that these guys are the real deal, as it were. And I think that literally right up until the last moment, there was a lot of uncertainty as to the outcome. And I mean, that goes for the people inside the party as well as outside. But I think that, I mean, as you say, I've been in the party's orbit for a number of years. I've been a supporter for a number of years. Before Farage came back, I was involved when Tice was the leader. But I think that these local election results do show that actually Reform is building the critical mass necessary to overthrow the two-party system. And in my mind, that is the principal goal at this time in British politics. Conversations about, the specifics of what that revolution might look like, I think are actually secondary to breaking the structure, because the structure, as we know, is the source of the problem. It's the fact that we do not have actually a real democracy in this country, because this very thin public-facing layer of government that we elect and that we interact with in the House of Commons, for one thing, don't really seem to be running the country. And even if they were, they tend to be, I think, in the eyes of most people, people that they don't trust, people that they don't relate to, people that they don't feel represented by, most crucially. So I think that Reform being the vehicle to tear down that system, I think that Reform is the vehicle to tear down that system. And I think these local election results show that to be the case. I mean, I saw a poll today that had Reform at 33% if a general election were to be called today. And that is, I mean, that would translate to something like 450 seats, leaving the Conservative Party on less than 10. I mean, it's not quite 0 seats, but it's pretty close. So I think that, obviously a general election is still a long ways out. But I think that there is a growing sense among ordinary people that actually we might be able to achieve something here, because Reform, most crucially, also now has household name recognition. Right, everybody knows who Farage is, everybody knows who the party is, and we can't underestimate the importance of that. As much as it's frustrating that our political system is essentially a popularity contest, that is the way it is. That's the hand we have to play. And so I think the fact that Reform is building this momentum, you can't deny it. It's obvious. And I think that, if that's the vehicle we have, and if these are the guys to do it, I think let's go for it,
Is there an argument that it doesn't actually meaningfully break the two-party system if Reform just replaces the Tories? I mean, because I believe Tice wanted to be a Tory. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, Dame Andrew Jenkins used to be, Lee Anderson used to be, Sarah Poachin used to be. So you go, if this is just the new Tories and the Tories get obliterated, has that really changed anything, or is that just a clever rebrand?
Well, this is the crucial question. I think a lot of people have been rightly concerned about the number of Tories, not just in the public-facing element of the party, but also behind the scenes, that have been brought in to essentially run the thing. Because, politics is always a question not of what, when, why, or how, but who. It's always a question of people. And so if it's the same people occupying the structure, well, the name and the aesthetics of the structure are kind of irrelevant, because the people who occupy it are going to give it its direction and its kind of, its ideology at the end of the day. So if it is the case that this is just a rebranded Tory party, then I think that people will rightly be very angry about that. Let's imagine that Reform do win a large, stonking majority at the next general election, and then they just turn out to be the same, but a slightly lighter shade of blue. I think people will be furious, and I don't really know what happens after that. And so I think that Reform need to be wary of appearing that way, but also actually being that. And I think there's an aspect to Reform's kind of character as a party. It's of a certain generation, right? Let's just say. And whilst their support among the youth is growing, and I can tell you that anecdotally, that certainly among young men, Reform is getting more and more popular. I think that there remains this kind of residual kind of boomerishness to the party. God love them. And for that reason, I don't know how possible it's going to be right now for the party to break out of that kind of 1970s, 1980s conservative, small c conservative mold. Because actually, when you really drill down into it, the foundational philosophy that reform has is essentially Thatcherism. If you listen to Farage speak or if you listen to Tice speak, their primary concern is always economics. They are liberal when it comes to social and cultural issues. They're more conservative than the likes of the Lib Dems and the Labour Party and all the rest of it, but they remain liberal when it comes to issues like, let's say, gay marriage, for example, or abortion, and all these sorts of things. They're not, as far as I'm aware, hugely conservative in these departments. They hold to this kind of actually quite English idea that if something doesn't affect me, then it's not my business. And I think that's quite appealing to a lot of people. But with that being said, I think that was that's the attitude the Tory party has had for decades. And it's for that reason that so many people, the likes of Peter Hitchens and others, view them as being a fundamentally non-conservative party. So I think Reform need to be careful about falling into that same trap of not being prepared to discuss cultural issues, because I think that's really where the conversation is headed. I mean, it's where the conversation's at, certainly, in the circles that you and I move in. Because, we think that economics is kind of... the economy is a tool to be used, as far as I'm concerned. It shouldn't be an end in and of itself. So I think if they continue to focus purely on the economic, and all the while they stick to this, what I think is quite an outdated economic program, I think there is this worry that they will transform into the Tory Party 2.0. But with that being said, as much as there are former Tories in the ranks, there is also a real undercurrent of new blood. People who haven't been in politics before at all, who have never taken an interest in politics, but feel compelled to get involved because of the way they see their country going, which I think is very admirable. It's how I feel myself. In ordinary times, I would have no interest in politics whatsoever. I never thought I would be in politics when I was growing up. But just because of how badly governed this country has been, I feel that it is my duty to be involved. And I think there's a lot of other people in Reform who feel that way, who don't bring with them that baggage that comes from being a conservative in the past. Because I don't think of myself as a conservative. I think that conservatism is ultimately an ideology of cowardice. I think the conservative is afraid of change, of radical change. But actually, radical change is what this country needs. And I think Reform need to embrace that. They need to embrace their radicalism, because there's a real appetite for it as well. When it comes to actually getting elected, I think there is an appetite for something that is truly different, which, to go back to the breaking of the two-party system, I think that's how they do that. They have to say, look, there is a fag paper's width between the Labour and Conservative parties, but actually we represent a fundamentally different style of politics, and that politics can't be conservative. It can't be Toryism all over again.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes maybe slightly provocatively say that they're basically the old Lib Dems. I mean, I don't think they're a Conservative Party. Reform, small c, it really. I'm not sure they're even a right wing party. We could debate it. One thing that came to my mind then when you were speaking was, I can't remember who wrote the article now, but I think it was an event that Darren Grimes had put on, and there was an interesting article about it where Daniel Hannan was speaking and Steve Baker was speaking, and they just didn't cut through at all amongst the Zoomers. And yet Farage strangely did, even though ostensibly he was talking about the same kind of boomer stuff that they might struggle to relate to. They weren't interested in the Thatcherite approach of those other two. But Farage, strangely, as a sort of totemic figure, cuts through to the younger generation, even though his policies and beliefs might not be that much different. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that Farage, for his whole career, has been, at the very least, prepared to speak in the language of what amounts to identity. And that, I think, certainly from my perspective and from the perspective of a lot of other young Reform supporters, that's really the principal issue, outside of, things like being able to afford a house, for example. But when it comes to culture and values and this sort of thing, the likes of Hannan and Baker and so on, they might mouth along to kind of Tony Blair approved, Michael Gove issued British values that were, kind of enshrined in law under the reign of David Cameron. But actually, when it comes to British identity and who we are as a people, I think that Farage for a long time has radiated a certain, well, there's no other way to put it. He's radiated a certain Britishness that others have failed to capture, because the likes of Tories who only care about economics, they tend to just come across as empty suits, who are difficult to relate to. And even though Farage is a career politician, he's been a politician for the better part of 30 years now, and was before that a city boy, in spite of that, he's able to have this kind of common appeal to ordinary people, and that's because I think he does have this. He's in touch with his Britishness. I think that's really what it comes down to. And so, whether or not Reform are prepared to have an explicit conversation about British identity, which is something I've been pushing them to have for some time now, and to move away from the language of British values, which is a meaningless phrase. Um, Whether they will do that, I think, remains to be seen. But I think, once again, if they wanted to truly capture the imagination of the public, and especially the young, who are so desperate for a sense of identity, then they would embrace that kind of rhetoric, I think. And that, I think, is it's why Farage has been so successful over his career. Is there has been this kind of um, unspoken recognition of British identity in his kind of style, in the way that he dresses, in the way that he speaks, in the way that he presents himself in marketing materials and that sort of thing. And I think that bringing that to the fore and making that, the entire brand of the party, which I think is what they're doing, I think that would be only to their benefit.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, of course, your generation may struggle to relate to Thatcherism because you haven't seen the economic benefits. Maybe we can go into that later. But the other thing that comes to my mind there is when you talk about identity, were you concerned, and I'll admit that I was, when Farage was on that interview with Stephen Edgington, former guest on this show, and Edgington asked him just outright in his brilliantly forthright style, are you worried about demographic decline? And he cited some stats about the decline of white British people over the recent years, last 20 years. And Farage said, no, not at all. And then he said he wasn't worried, though, about areas where there was no English culture. And of course, this was an absurdity. How could there be, why would there be completely foreign people but totally English culture? As I like to say, if the country was 100% Japanese, the religions would be Buddhism and Shinto, and there'd be sumo wrestling. This is obvious, but he wanted to say, no, I'm very worried about the collapse of English culture, but not worried at all about the collapse of English people. So is this the central problem with reform?
Mm. Now, yeah, along with so many others, I was disturbed by those comments, because I think we are, all of us, Nick, products of our time and place, and I can't help but think that there is a kind of generational mental block that sometimes happens. I think with men of Farage's and indeed Tice's generation, where they cannot bring themselves to recognize the reality that the things that they call values and the things that the British state themselves call values, the British values of, a sense of fair play and tolerance and fairness and all the rest of it, they don't come from nowhere. Like, they don't just emerge out of the ether fully formed and are then, embraced by a people. They are the product of a people. They are the product of a particular group, and in a particular time and place, who have kind of over well, in England's case, over the period of thousands of years, has cultivated a culture and traditions, that has led to the emergence, organically, of these kinds of ideas and values. And the idea that you can just abstract that out, cut away the roots, and just transplant it onto a different group of people, I think we are seeing in real time that is an absolutely failed project. That is what the project of kind of diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism in Britain has been. It has been the attempt to transplant English and British identity and apply it from the top down onto groups who have no history here, who have no shared culture or values with this land, and it doesn't work. And I think that there is a discomfort that comes with admitting that reality, because it inevitably opens the door to accusations of bigotry from dishonest people in the press. But quite frankly, I think that all the while we're still talking in the language of values, we're missing the mark. We're not talking about the actual issue at hand. Because I agree with you, Nick. I think that to say that you're not concerned about the demographic decline of a group, but you are concerned about the disappearance of their culture, to me, there's no, well, the two are one and the same. There is no distinction between the two, because the one is the product of the other. So I think it's one of those things that if you think about it for 2 seconds, you can see that it's just a nonsensical kind of statement to make. But as I say, I think that there is perhaps there's certainly a cautiousness in the leadership of Reform to have conversations like this, because, as I said, they fear the names they will be called by the media, if they do. But with that said, I do think their growing momentum and electoral success might make them more prepared and more bold in the kinds of rhetoric they are prepared to use. And I would encourage Farage and I would encourage the other members of the leadership of Reform to recognise that they shouldn't be playing by the rules set out by the establishment, by the media, by people who will never respect them and who they will never be welcome among, and who always call them words like racist. They should recognise that and realise that we need to break with the establishment narrative about what Britishness actually is. It's not values, it's people.
Yeah, I mean, it's good that you're trying to persuade them. My concern is that someone like you will ultimately not be welcome in Reform because of this disdain the leadership seems to have for anyone basically on the right. I mean, the other day Farage came out and said, "Look, you made a reference to the alt right Tommy Robinson people, two completely different things for a start. Tommy Robinson,
Yeah.
as far as I can see, is a kind of neocon with obviously a particular interest in Islam, but that could also apply to Douglas Murray." And someone like Sam Harris was a liberal with a particular concern with Islam. Christopher Hitchens on the left, so you wouldn't say he was in any way alt right. That's a separate movement in America, much more radical movement. So completely just word salad, really, just putting together disparate elements have nothing to do with each other. But again, it's just a signaling we don't want anything to do with that lot online right people, blah blah. But as far as I can see, that doesn't that mean people like you probably, you know what I mean? So
It may do. It may do. I mean, thus far, I have not been completely sort of ostracised from reform circles. I'm aware that there have been occasions where, well, certain people within the party have taken issue with things that I have said. But to be honest, you know, I'm not wedded to any party. I'm not loyal. My loyalty, my first loyalty doesn't lie with a political party. My first loyalty lies with my country. For whom I am very, very scared. I want to bring children into this country, hopefully in the next couple of years, and I imagine what this country
you
might
don't mean
look
on
like
boats,
when they're
by the
my
way.
age.
When you say bring children into the country, you don't mean on small boats. Right?
No, I
Just to
don't. I
clarify.
mean, I mean, I mean, in a, I mean, have children of my own. To be clear, but no, I mean, I had this realization recently, Nick, that my children will probably see the turn of the century. They will probably see the year 2100, and I was imagining what this country might look like if it remains on that, on the current course that it's on. Um, and the kind of world they may bring children and grandchildren into, and it's terrifying to ponder. It's a terrifying prospect that this country may become minority indigenous British. It may become Islamized to a greater extent. It may, where Islam enters our politics in a far more pronounced fashion. I think we're seeing the beginnings of that with the kind of independent Gaza MPs in Parliament. And so, with regards to reform and whether they're going to be prepared to have these conversations, as I say, if having these opinions is enough to get me kind of kicked out of the party, well, so be it. Because I think that, you know, we need to be prepared to have these difficult conversations. And I recognize that reform are in the business of winning elections, and I understand that there are strategies in place to appeal to a wider electorate who aren't prepared to confront these issues at this time. But I think there has to be a recognition that the gravity of the situation is such that there will come a time in the very near future where difficult conversations are necessary. Now, I've been asked before whether I consider myself to be a part of the online right, which is a phrase you just used. And I sort of think, this distinction between the kind of the non-online right and the online right is kind of, it's a bit of an illusion, because those of us who are in the so-called online right, we also move in political circles in the real world. Like, we also, I write for the most widely circulated newspaper in the country, which is read by thousands of people. And as much as I talk to and know people from the kind of online sphere, I also talk to MPs and lawmakers. And so this distinction, I don't think, is always that helpful, because I think, I also think that the online sphere is a lot of where it's where some of the best ideas come from as well. So the idea that they are somehow fringe, I think, within reform, certainly there needs to be a recognition that it's where a lot of their greatest thinkers are. And reform would do well to bring those thinkers in, even if not explicitly. We don't have to have like Carl Benjamin being like a reform MP, but at the very least, there's nothing to be gained from counter signaling these people. I think there needs to be, and the left, by the way, recognise this. The left never punch leftwards at their enemies. You never see, for example, I don't know, Angela Rayner going after Novara Media, for instance. But they're singing from the same hymn sheet. They belong to the same faction, and they're ultimately fighting for the same cause. And so I think that reform would do well to adopt that same kind of approach.
Yeah, I've noticed that. You could argue Starmer did that with Corbyn, but yes, in general, they never punch left, and the right always do it. The thing they're most terrified of on the right is being called right wing or conservative. Well, certainly right wing. Yeah, it's very strange. But many people tell me so. You may have noticed with there's some quite passionate fans of reform. So if I critique them in any way, a lot of people, it's half and half in my comments, but people say, "Shut up, Nick. You just need to get with it, and we need to win this." And they tell me things like, "No, Farage is just playing the game now, and then they'll do the policies we want when they're in power." It seems like a dangerous game to me because it seems like it'd be so hard to enact these policies. At very least, I want to know the intention is there. But
Mm.
do you believe in this thing of being cautious now and then you suddenly reveal your real policies in power?
I don't know for sure whether that is what they're doing. I personally, I think that when Farage says things like he's not concerned with the demographic decline of white British people, I think he's telling the truth. I think he is actually saying what he believes, which is a
Yeah.
fairly common view, again, among that kind of generation. There's an unwillingness to have conversations of a demographic nature, quite frankly. And so, the idea that they are, as it were, concealing their power levels before they get into power. I don't necessarily buy that that's what they're doing. I think it may be to some extent when it comes to, for example, deporting illegal migrants. They've been unwilling to, as Rupert Lowe has, commit to the deportation of every illegal migrant currently residing in Britain, of whom there is about 2 million. I wonder whether there is a strategy in place there to not reveal their true plans with regards to that problem until they're in office. But with that being said, I think that the reason that Blair, for example, had to adopt this strategy where he concealed the true extent of his radicalness and the extremeness of the program that he was going to bring in. The reason he had to do that was because if he had just come out and said it, it would have been deeply unpopular, as it has proven to be, right? Whereas with reform, as has been shown by the local elections and by their polling numbers, they represent the majority position. They are the most popular party in the country because the kind of change that they represent, which is change of a, broadly speaking, right wing nature, is very popular because it's rooted in reality. It's rooted in common sense. It's rooted in what's beneficial and in the interests of ordinary people. It doesn't serve abstract ideology, and it's just fundamentally sensible, right? And so the idea that they would have to somehow conceal their intentions, I don't think is necessary. As I've said already, I think if anything, they should be more openly radical. They should be more openly energized and dynamic and promising real change. Because as much as the English and British spirit is kind of conservative in the small c sense, in that it prefers, the tried to the untried, the near to the far, the familiar to the unknown, and all the rest of it. There is still, nevertheless, an appetite for radical change in Britain. This is absolutely the case, especially among the young. And whilst it might not be a kind of well articulated radicalness, I think if reform were to fill the vacuum that currently exists for a truly radical offering, they would see huge success. And I think they've secured a huge amount of the population already, and those kind of floating voters, I think, would be won over with that kind of radicalness.
Yeah.
Um,
Because we're in a very different time. We're in a time. It's almost like I'm not. This is only an analogy, so calm down, people. But it's almost like wartime, where we see a different side to the British, because it's so extreme what's been done with the Boris wave and so on, and illegal immigration as well. And for years and years before the Boris wave, you go, this is such an extreme experiment. You are now changing the nature of British people. But also, we've always been far more radical on immigration than any politician has cared to acknowledge for decades and decades. And certain people have lost their careers over this by being actually in line with the public. And then the establishment's gone, no, no, that's very tasteless. But this worried me again with Farage with the Edgerton interview. But you sort of alluded to it there, where he was very worried about deportations, saying they couldn't be done. Late, and as you say, that puts him unnecessarily to the left of the people. But then lately, maybe he's tacked back a little bit. He's talking about a minister for deportations. So then other days you go, maybe they are getting it. So I'm not actually completely sure where they stand at this point on that.
well, once again, I mean, I don't think there's any reason to not take Farage at his word. Like in that interview, I think he was genuinely speaking his mind, which is on the one hand concerning. I think people were rightly, worried by the things that he was saying with regards to demographics and deportations, and later in his interview with Winston Marshall about Islam. I think people were rightly worried about those comments that he made. But I
when he
would
said
also
we
add,
will lose. In
yeah,
case the listener somehow missed it, if we take a certain stance towards Islam, look at the demographic change. We will lose. We will lose. It was like, hang on, you're talking about 6.5% of the population. That's a bit nuts.
yeah, yeah, and I think it was pretty poorly advised for him to say that because that is just not what ordinary people want to hear. Quite frankly, it's a message of submission, if you will. And so, I don't think I don't think we have any reason to believe that he was not speaking his mind. But with that being said, I think something Farage has shown himself to be is very open to changing his mind, as public opinion kind of goes. And I think that based on some conversations I've had recently with senior members of the party, there's a far greater appetite among the leadership now to have those kinds of conversations and to address those kinds of issues. And that has only come from public pressure, and it's only come from an increasingly radical support base who are demanding that the party, that they are vesting their hopes and that basically that the future of Britain in actually represents the interests of ordinary people. And I think that should take the shape of committing to deporting all illegal migrants. It should take the shape of having a grown-up conversation about the influence of Islam in our society. It should be a conversation about the fact that if the white indigenous British population is allowed to become a minority, that will fundamentally and irreversibly change the nature of the country. I think there is a public appetite for these kinds of conversations if they are done and had with nuance and with respect, and in a way that is palatable to ordinary people. So I think that those people who are writing off reform and writing off Farage as being a lost cause, I think they are getting it wrong. Because again, we forget that a general election is probably 4 years away, and a hell of a lot can happen in that time. A hell of a lot of, and frankly, I think if things continue as they are, the British public at large are going to become increasingly angry, increasingly radical, and reform should seek to capture that energy.
Yeah, and since you brought him up, I do have to ask you: were you put off by the treatment of Rupert Lowe?
So yeah, so Rupert is somebody who I don't know him well, but I've met him a number of times, and he's somebody who I respect enormously. I think he's a spectacularly effective politician, and he has been responsible for some serious progress when it comes to those issues that I was just talking about, those kind of difficult conversations that I think the British public are increasingly eager to have. I think the way that it was dealt with by the party was poor. I think that the reporting him to the police was, totally just there was obviously no strategy in place there, and we've seen Farage recently all but condemn that decision by the chairman Zia Youssef to report Rupert Lowe to the police. I find it really demoralising that whole thing happened, and it's obvious to me from both sides that there is no path to reconciliation. Rupert Lowe will not be rejoining Reform, and so I think a lot of people were rightly quite disturbed by that whole situation, and it certainly made me question my support of the party. But it's one of those things where you know politics being what it is, we have to be prepared to hold our nose sometimes. And I think that Rupert Lowe, in his role now, in being the kind of the the rightward pressure on reform, I think if anything, he's going to be a lot more effective there than he was inside the party, because he's hugely popular online and in the real world. And I think all the while he is holding reform's feet to the fire on those kind of difficult issues. I think that's a good thing. And whether he joins the Conservative Party or whether he starts his own party, I think that his role as being the rightmost element of the British political system, as I say, may prove to be even more may prove to make him even more effective than he would have been within reform. So I think there is there's a silver lining perhaps to that whole that whole disastrous episode, which is that him being outside the party might actually make the party more right wing, paradoxically.
Interesting, yeah. So, do you think there's any room for that party? Because I've had, again, we had Ben Habib on, and the comments are very divided between Ben's correct, he should start his own party soon, which obviously we know he is, but it's a question of organising it. And then other people saying sour grapes Ben and all that. But do you think a party, perhaps with Ben and Rupert Lowe in it, is useful, or is it just this kind of too many parties on the right? The Hobbit party. You always like to reclaim, renew, refresh. It just ends up kind of Hobbit Party's made up, by the way, but it should be one. But is it just going to be too many parties, or is it necessary to hold reform to account? Let's say they get in power X number of years, they're struggling, as anyone will be when they're in power. They need an actual party on the right to hold them to account if the Tories have faded away.
I think that it would be a good thing to have. I'm not one of these people who thinks that we do have to have all of our hopes and dreams kind of invested in one vehicle. I think that once again, it's going to keep reform honest to have a force like that in British politics, because unless the flatlining non-leadership of Kemi Badenoch is brought mercifully to an end, the Tories are done. The Tories are over, and unless Robert Jenrick and his faction take control of the party, which is not outside the realms of possibility, I think the Tories are done. And so there does need to be pressure from the right on reform, because if there isn't, I think that the tendency inevitably will be to drift towards the centre and then towards the left, because that's within democratic systems, that does seem to be the tendency of organisations. This is what Curtis Yarvin talks about with Cthulhu always swimming left. I think
Yeah,
this goes
and
for a
Robert
party like.
Conquest as well. Robert Conquest's famous law: any organisation that isn't explicitly right wing will move to the left.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I think the same goes. There's no reason that we should think that reform, those laws wouldn't apply to reform as well. So I think that a party applying pressure from the right on reform would be a good thing. And I think that Rupert Lowe is certainly the man to lead it, and Ben Habib, somebody else who I respect hugely, would be a spectacular, deputy leader or chairman or whatever else. And if it comes to pass, that reform is not the vehicle of radical change that we hope it to be, well, it would probably be a good thing to have a backup plan, quite frankly. And once again, I say that as somebody who is not, I'm not loyal to any party, to my dying breath. I think that whatever is most effective, whatever is going to be able to save Britain, that's where our loyalty politically should lie. And right now, that is reform. Right now, that party is reform. But I think that as I say, a kind of more dynamic, more energized landscape is always a good thing. And when there's only one option on offer, as there has been for the last, God knows how many decades with the Conservative Party, things tend to stultify and things tend to become stagnant. And when there is no other kind of game in town, well, what are people supposed to do?
Yeah. All right. It's a nuanced position, quite similar to mine. But I do get savage for this sort of stuff. Like, no, Nick, just back reform. But and I did vote for them, so I'm not a reform hater. But I am just trying to be honest and objective and just say what I think. But well, you can't be totally objective, but you know what I mean. So you mentioned Jenrick. Is Jenrick to the right of Farage? And if and when the Tories do install Jenrick, can that save them?
Mm. That's a really interesting question. So Jenrick is somebody else who, again, I don't know well, but I've spoken to on a couple of occasions. And he, based on the people who I know who have worked around him and who, for example, worked on his leadership campaign, it does seem that his transformation into being quite a hardline, anti-migration, Islam skeptic kind of voice, it was very quick. It was a kind of road to Damascus moment for him, by all accounts, and that inevitably calls up questions. Certainly does. I think that people are right to be skeptical. But with that being said, I believe that it is genuine. I believe that he is authentically right wing, I think if you were to map them on a spectrum on issues like immigration and Islam, and even, I mean, I don't know a lot about Robert Jenrick's economic kind of philosophy, but I don't buy that he's a kind of old school Thatcherite in the same way that Farage is. I'm kind of basing that on vibes. I'm not necessarily basing that on any evidence. So, make of that what you will. But yeah, I would say that Jenrick is to the right of Farage. I don't think there's any question about that, actually. Now, whether that makes him more legitimate or more viable as a leader or indeed as a prime minister, I don't think that the one necessarily means the other. But it's certainly interesting that he was able to run his leadership campaign to the right of Farage. One would think that given Reform's position in the British political landscape, that wouldn't have been possible. But the fact that it was, I think certainly for a lot of people called into question the sturdiness of Reform's position. And I think if Jenrick was to become the leader of the Conservative Party, it's quite possible that they would become that rightward pressure on the Reform Party that I spoke about before. I don't think it's out of the question that the Conservative Party claw back a lead over reform. I think that under the right leadership, it's absolutely possible. But with that being said, I think the public at large are done with the Conservative brand. I think that the Conservative brand for a lot of people is mud. People don't respect Tories. I think their name is associated with untrustworthiness, self-interest, running the country into the ground, not really standing for anything, being pretty fickle and just moving with the wind. But I think under the leadership of somebody like Jenrick, who does actually have a philosophy and moreover is prepared to do the hard work when it comes to policy and research and this sort of thing. He's got a fantastic team behind him. I know a couple of the people who work for him. I think that that would actually pose a far more significant threat to reform. And it's possible, actually, and during the Conservative Party leadership race, I actually really hoped that Jenrick would win, purely for the fact that it would lead, I think, to an arms race between Reform and the Conservative Party, where they're essentially trying to outbaste each other at every opportunity. And I think that if Jenrick were to take the reins now, the same thing would happen. Because the Tory party being in an even more dire position now than they were at the time of that leadership race. I think the incentive would be even stronger for them to be trying to outdo Reform at every single turn. So once again, it's all about these kind of incentives and a sort of political landscape where the two parties vying for power are both on the right and they're both trying to be more radical than the other in order to win the imaginations of the public. That's like an ideal situation for the situation we find ourselves in as a nation. But whether that will happen, I don't know. I think it's very unclear because the leadership of the Conservative Party seem absolutely committed to staying this course that led them to electoral ruin in 2024 and again just last week at the locals. So, we'll have to see. I think it's possible that we see a Jenrick takeover. If they have any sense, if the leadership of the party have any sense, that is what they'll do. But whether the leadership of the party have any sense, I think, is very much up in the air.
Yeah, it's been bizarre to hear Kemi say things like "we're an oasis of calm." It's like you just hit the iceberg. I don't know what you're talking about. And say that we need to wait 2 years and people will forget the old toys. Like you don't have 2 years. It doesn't seem to understand the threat. Which has been very frustrating for me because I used to do a podcast with Toby Young, for example. He was very pro Kemi. Lots of people who are far more experienced in this kind of arena than me, but they were all getting it completely wrong. And they think, oh, she won't be able to be attacked because she'll have like the race card. It's like, look at how they treated Swella Braverman. Obvious nonsense. So I knew it had to be Jenrick. Eventually, the Tories are realizing this, but in a way, it's not that strange. Just thinking out loud that Jenrick would be to the right of Reform because Reform is not necessarily a Conservative party, as we've said. It's not necessarily a right wing party. It wants to nationalise various things. It's concerned about tax breaks for people under 20,000, which is perfectly decent policy. And a lot of their voters are people making under 20,000 a year, whereas most of Labour's vote now comes from the over 70,000 a year people. So in a way, that's completely normal that the Tories. It's a different party, isn't it? The Tories have the shires still. Reform seems to have taken the red wall type people, and yet that in it doesn't actually make that much sense either because they're the socially conservative people, and as we've said, Reform's a little bit weak on social conservatism, so it's all a bit confused. I think people are,
Mm.
but at the moment, it's probably less articulate than that. It's we hate the two main parties, as you said at the start. We want to get rid of both of those. These lot are new. Let's give them a chance. It's probably not loads more complicated than that, and immigration being the big issue. But that's not really a question. That's me thinking out loud. But
Mm. Well, I
let
could,
me ask.
if
Go
I
on.
may, Nick, I will just come in
Yeah,
very quickly on that point because I, for a long time, have believed that Britain we need our equivalent of the kind of European right wing parties, like for example the AfD in Germany, known extremists, the AfD, the National Rally in France. These parties are of a very different flavour to kind of establishment standard conservative parties. There is a different vibe about them. They're certainly not left wing, but they're not really, they're not old school capitalistic Tories in that kind of way. And I think that Reform are still not occupying that space. Really, they're seeking to, as you said already, supplant and replace the Conservative Party rather than be something truly new and truly radical. And I think there is a bizarre world where the Conservative Party itself comes to occupy that position as being the kind of future facing paradoxically non-conservative right-wing offering, a right-wing politics that is more radical and more kind of action-oriented as opposed to cautious and afraid of radical change. A Jenrick-led Tory party, I could absolutely see it taking on that kind of character, where it is at once socially conservative, and not just like, not just diet socially conservative, but properly socially conservative, which the Conservative Party has been in the past, but at the same time not kind of ruthlessly capitalistic either, because I don't think there's an appetite for that kind of economic package at all among ordinary people, and certainly young people. The promise of capitalism and the free markets has absolutely zero purchase with young people in 2025, because from our perspective, we live under capitalism right now, and under that system, rightly or wrongly, people think that, and under that system, we can't afford a house, we can't work a job for which we're not excessively taxed, and for which we work, earn a decent wage, and so, and we can't afford to raise a family or any of this stuff, and so an offering that is not purely kind of capitalistic in nature, but has an economic philosophy that puts the interests of ordinary people first, where where you're not going to see, for example, asylum seekers put up in social housing, but where you might see Indigenous Brits put up in social housing. That, I think, is actually a very appealing offer. I mean, this is basically what the SDP has been trying to do for 50 years. And granted, they've not got hugely far with it. But actually, a Conservative Party made in that mould, that I think could be a far more appealing prospect to ordinary people. But once again, if reform were to occupy that space, that's also a good thing.
Yeah, very interesting. And Farage has explicitly distanced himself from those European parties and said, we're not like them. He said, we have some crossover, but we're a very different thing. He's been very clear about that. And those parties keep getting banned. I mean, AFD just got banned by intelligence services, then unbanned, I think, yesterday. But a national rally, they're trying to obviously stop Le Pen even running. Crazy things going on. Maybe we'll see reform get banned. But just on my last of my party political type questions. So we've just seen, as we record, Starmer has just the day before managed to strike a trade deal with the USA with Donald, his mate Donald. He used the word Donald 10 times in a few minutes, which I thought was hilarious. But best mates now. But it made me think, if Labour clocked up a few more wins like that, and if they just stopped a few votes and slightly reduced immigration, because they are the incumbent and because they hold the levers of power, and because the blob, one suspects, are more open to doing what Labour want, even though some of the infrastructure is even to the left of Starmer, like the activist judges, for example, that seem to actually thwart them to an extent. But because of all these things, and they're used to governing and all that, could Labour actually still pull it back? Actually, quite easily, with just a tiny bit of the things that people want. Trade deal with the US, that's a bit of a feel-good thing. Stop immigration, or stop the boats. Massively reduce legal immigration. If they actually, maybe they don't have the will to do it, but if they did, could they actually turn it around even after their local elections rubbing?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because this is something I don't see a lot of people addressing.
All right, that is the end of the free episode. But if you want the full podcast, go to nickdixon.net for all the extra content, all my articles. That is my Substack, nickdixon.net. And we need your help to keep this whole thing going, keep the lights on, this amazing production, hiring people, etc. nickdixon.net to support us. It's £5 a month, which is about the cost of some sort of fancy latte in London, or there's a slight discount if you get the yearly option, or it's just £5 a month. So we'll see you on nickdixon.net, and thank you very much.